Okay, welcome everybody to this Intellectual Shamans Humanistic Management webinar, and we're thrilled to have Stuart Hart with us today. If you look on the right side of your screen, there is a chat box, and you can put questions you might have for Stu into that chat box. Stu and I will talk for a while, and then we'll turn things over to your questions. And Michael's got you muted so that we don't hear all the background noise. As some of you may know, Stu was one of the people that participated in my book called Intellectual Shamans. I argue that the intellectual shaman is a healer, a sense maker, and a connector. And certainly I think we'll see that Stu fulfills all of those roles. Stu is one of the world's top authorities on the implications of environment and strategy and poverty for business strategy. According to Bloomberg Businessweek, he's one of the founding fathers of the base of the pyramid of the economic theory. He's also currently the Stephen Grossman Endowed Chair for Sustainable Business, professor and former director of the Sustainable Innovation MBA at the University of Vermont's Grossman School of Business. He's the S.C. Johnson Chair Emeritus in Sustainable Global Enterprise and Professor Emeritus of Management at Cornell University's Johnson Graduate School of Management. There he founded the Center for Sustainable Global Enterprise. He also serves as a distinguished fellow at the William Davidson Institute, the University of Michigan, and as the founder and president of Enterprise for a Sustainable World, and founding director of the Emergent Institute in Bangalore, India. I could go on, but I think some of the other details of Stu's very amazing life will probably come out as we talk. Let me start by saying, Stu, you've had a really interesting career and have really been one of the pioneers in management scholarship. One of the first people thinking about issues of sustainability. Can you give us a little bit of history of how you came to the idea that sustainability was important, and why in particular it was so important to you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, it was a very unlikely pathway. You know, I certainly had no inkling. You know, if we roll the clock back, you know, to say the 70s, which is probably about the time that the path started, I would have never, ever in a million years, you know, thought or even imagined that I'd be doing what I'm doing now at that point. Because I'd say the path really started looking at the world through an environmentalist lens. You know, I got very much caught up in the environmental movement, you know, in the late 60s and early 70s. And, you know, there were a couple of professors in my undergrad, you know, that really stirred that passion. And I went on, I don't have an MBA, you know, I did my master's work at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, you know, in the mid 70s, and then worked in the NGO world for a period of time. You know, I was pretty convinced that corporations were the enemy, and they probably were. That may still be, you know, in some cases, but, you know, did that for a few years, and it became less and less enthralling as time went on, because it was mostly about stopping projects, you know, and, you know, kind of negative vision. Maybe I always had an aversion to negative vision. And, you know, I met someone, you know, on that path who was a PhD trained guy, you know, who thought differently about these issues, right? He sort of had a more interesting and nuanced perspective, and had studied companies. You know, his PhD was about the forest products industry, so he'd studied companies, and that began to shift my view a bit. And I got more and more interested in strategy. You know, kind of why would companies or government agencies or whoever the actor would be, why would they undertake such seemingly destructive things? You know, it became a more interesting question than just trying to stop it. So, you know, I ended up, after a period of time, going back. I did my PhD, you know, focused on strategy at Michigan. I did my PhD at Michigan, which is what originally brought me to Ann Arbor. And at the time, there really wasn't business schools. This was late 70s, right, and early 80s, and business schools were not the centers of intellectual craft, at that point in time. So,
to say the least.
yeah, right. So they were still being, sort of assailed as outliers, and they shouldn't be on university campuses because they don't really have an intellectual agenda and so forth. And so I didn't do a PhD in the business school because that was not very common, uh, and I spent a fair amount of time at the Institute for Social Research, at Michigan at the time, which is where this kind of stuff was really happening. Some of the best work on kind of organizational change, organization theory, technological innovation, was happening at ISR. So, my dissertation dealt with, engagement of different perspectives and the quality of strategic decisions. So it was kind of along along the Ed Freeman way of, thinking about stakeholders as improving decision quality, and tried to study that empirically. And all of the cases that I looked at had to do with sort of environmental change and environmental innovation. And I was able to draw on this work I did, previously. And one thing led to another. After I finished, we had a bunch of funded work, and so I stayed at the institute for a period of time. As after I finished my PhD, because we had funding, it was interesting, and this was the time that now business schools were becoming more academic, right? It's like the '80s, and there was as probably you well know and remember, there was a big hiring wave during the '80s of PhD trained people in business schools in an effort to make them more academic, and now we look back in retrospect and we can say we overachieved on that one. But that was very much, kind of the time. And so even for somebody like me, which, I really didn't have any experience really much working with businesses, didn't know that much about it, but I had a bunch of offers, right? Because they were interested in the kind of the PhD training. And that included one at Michigan at the business school. So, I had a young family, and so I figured, what the heck? So I stayed and became an assistant professor at the University of Michigan Business School, and got immediately thrown into the classroom, into the MBA classroom, and it was completely clueless at that point in time, and really cratered it, the first year, because I had no idea what I was doing, and there was it was a teaching group, right? Because there were 6 sections of the core course in strategy, which is what I was teaching, and it was another rookie. The 3 professors were 2 rookies, me and another rookie, and then the person who was the teaching head had been there for 2 years. So,
ouch.
So, needless to say, I think we may have set an all-time record for worst teaching evaluations in history, and it was bad enough that they had to call in like the heavy artillery. So they called in none other than Professor C.K. Prahalad, who had been there for a period of time, was a tenured professor, had already made a name for himself, and just was an incredible teacher. So he became the course head the next year. They allowed me to kind of stay, in that teaching in that group, but it was really CK who I learned to teach. That he's who taught me. You don't learn much about teaching in a doctoral program, and you learn even less about it if it's not in a business school. So that was extremely enlightening and educational. But he also kind of passed along some other DNA, which had to do with just kind of a view of the world, and a view of a professor or a scholar's role in the world from a business school perch. Now, so he came in before this big hiring wave of PhD trained people, but obviously survived it, and stayed, but would have been, and was one of the first people to say that had he come in, kind of post wave, he probably would have never come close to getting tenure, right? He would have been shown the door. And I remember him saying that, pretty clearly and pretty vividly. And he's probably right, that somebody like him would have been shown the door. He would have never gotten tenure. And that kind of stuck with me, because here I am in this new environment, and I'm teaching the core course, and I got better at it, right? I mean, the second year was way better than the first year. And then, I'm under pressure to write these journal articles, which was now the growing pressure, even in the 80s, right? As business schools became more academic. And, I knew how to do that, right? I mean, I did have that training and did, kind of write and publish some of those. But I'd never really lost interest or passion around environment, right? That didn't go away, right? Just because now suddenly I had this professor job in the business school. And I kept trying to bring that in, right? And generally, I would say for almost everyone, with the exception of a few, probably Prahalad, one of those, I was soundly rebuffed and told things like, if you persist on trying to do this, it will destroy your career. Just kind of put your nose to the grindstone. You've got to publish and teach. You're doing better teaching. Kind of keep at that. And and then maybe 3 or 4 years from now, 5 years from now, you'll go up for tenure. You'll get tenure. Then you can think about what it is you think it is you really want to do. But hey, you got this work you're doing on strategic decision process and strategic decision making. Just keep after that, and and teach the courses, and give up on this crazy environment stuff. It just doesn't belong in the business school. And I remember being really, really frustrated and dissatisfied with that. And as time went on, it's now it's getting to be the late 80s now, and I'm just increasingly dissatisfied. Just because they were paying me twice as much, as I would have made if I stayed over in the Institute for Social Research, what wasn't enough, right, to kind of quell what was really not very satisfying work, right? And just kind of having to teach this course, I got better at it, but I didn't really believe that much in the content, right? You just sort of, when you're teaching stuff like that, you kind of go through the motions because this is what you teach in the core course in corporate strategy. And I wasn't that in, I'd published most of the stuff off my dissertation at that point, and now, you're under pressure to continue on that path. And I didn't find it very compelling. So at some point, late 80s, like 1990, there was a very distinct decision made on my part. And what prompted it in part was the arrival of a new dean in the business school, and a new dean this is at Michigan, a new dean in the School of Natural Resources and Environment, right? Because I had ties over in that school. And the new dean that came to the School of Natural Resources and Environment came from Yale, so he came from that same environment that I knew. And he held what was then the only joint chair that existed, I think, between the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and the School of Organization and Management at Yale. And so this was a joint program between those two. And he came to Michigan with the intention of creating something like that at Michigan. So he and the new dean of the business school kind of hit it off. And that opened the door for me to kind of open the window to jump through. And I did, with a passion. And so I made a very conscious choice in the year 1990 that I was going to devote the rest of, my professional life to working on this connection between, it was called business and environment back then. It was before sustainability as a term kind of made its way into the business world. And what enabled that was the creation of this new joint dual degree program at Michigan, which was then called the Corporate Environmental Management Program, and, is now the Herb Institute Dual Master's Program. And that's what kind of set me on that path, right? I mean, so it was a somewhat fraught, somewhat meandering, circuitous path. And maybe the only thing that was consistent and constant was, a passion and a real concern about environment. So sorry for that long-winded tale, but that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
That's, it's perfect to hear that story. You've actually been fairly peripatetic in your career, having moved from a number of different universities, and I know you said that you had encountered resistance to the sustainability agenda early on. So we could also call you a serial center founder. Over time, you've moved away from Michigan, where you founded the environmental management program, as you mentioned, now the Herb Institute. Then you were at North Carolina's Keenan Flagler Business School, where you founded the Center for Sustainable Enterprise and the base of the pyramid, and then at Cornell, where you founded the Center for Sustainable Global Enterprise. And we'll get to your current position in a minute. And I'm wondering if you're willing to share what precipitated some of these moves and some of the obstacles you encountered in trying to tackle a topic that wasn't mainstream.
Yeah. So I think what, in a very interesting and somewhat paradoxical way, it was rejection, right? That really did it. So after I jumped through that window, right, and got involved in this I became the director of this new dual degree program. That was really like a big dose of oxygen, right? I mean, that was just really cool and fun and exciting. The students were great, right, and we had corporate support, right? These were the early days of eco-efficiency and pollution prevention. So, the Dows and DuPonts of the world were all over this. And that meant that the deans had cover now to say that this was important, right, in a business school. So the argument that this doesn't belong in a business school went away. But at the same time, I'm now kind of moving into this new domain. And so I began writing about that, right, and sort of shifting my focus away from the strategy process stuff, that I had been doing, strategic decision making and strategy process stuff. Not that that's irrelevant, but kind of shifting my, that was always my interest, and so I began really focusing on that and beginning to write, about this emerging idea of business and environment. And it was, about the time that the organization and Natural Environment Interest Group, that was being started up at the Academy, and there were a few other people, not many, like Paul Shrivastava and Tom Gladwin was at NYU at the time, who I would speak with about this, but it was still early days, right? And it was seen as, again, kind of a suicidal career move to make, to do something like this. But I just didn't care, right? And because it was, I just felt like it was what I was interested in and what I thought was important. So, all my teaching was, really focused around this. I wasn't teaching in the core strategy course anymore. We had to develop these new courses for the dual degree program, and what that curriculum would look like and so forth. And so you get tied up in that. And then I began writing, on that topic, and 3 years go by, and it's time to go up for tenure, right? And so I went up for tenure, and I was denied tenure.
So that's important. I want especially newer scholars to hear that you can survive being denied tenure and be successful after it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I say that the somewhat paradoxical, if I look back on it now, I think it was being rejected for tenure that's what really opened it up for me. But it was the rather odd circumstance where I was rejected for tenure, and in the same meeting with the dean, he invited me to stay on, to continue running this dual degree program off the tenure track. So I agreed to do that kind of under protest, that I didn't see myself, because I knew that path, right? There are other people who had followed that path, and you then tend to become kind of a co-specialized asset who is a permanent fixture at one institution. You can't get a job anywhere else. Mm-hmm. And I didn't really have that vision for myself. I didn't see myself as just kind of an off tenure track program administrator, even though that was what was being offered. So, I accepted it because I didn't have a better option, sitting there at that point in time. And so stayed on as, an adjunct, and was the director of the corporate environmental management program. That was still cool. Loved the students. And it was during that period of time when no one expected me to do anything other than just run that program, that I wrote the stuff that really put me on the map. Right?
So can you share with us a little bit about how that came about? And you mentioned C.K. Prahalad a little while ago, and I know you see him as a mentor, and the importance of the role he played in your life, scholarly life.
Yeah. So, that I had begun, there was enough time that I could sort of bring together the work around strategy, and then to begin to bring the ideas around business and environment, and now, you know, the idea of sustainability now begins to come forward. So there was enough time to kind of bake on those things, right? To commingle them, right? And that was the early thinking. And then I wrote this piece called The Natural Resource-Based View of the Firm, right? Because the resource-based view had, you know, Jay Barney had articulated that, and it just, you know, I was able to kind of collide those two worlds together, right? And so that piece that came out in like '95 in the Academy of Management Review was a really important piece for me, right? That it sort of summarized the early thinking on this, but then also kind of landed it back, you know, put it in terms of a theory that was kind of a rising theory in good currency in the strategy domain. So it brought those two worlds together. But then I was able to kind of take that thinking and leverage it into a piece in HBR, right? And it was CK that made that introduction. I had never really thought about publishing in HBR before, you know. I figured it was really just about hitting the good academic journals. So certainly AMR was a good academic journal for the natural resource-based view of the firm. But then, you know, the more time I spent around him, and I could see, you know, the impact that he had out there in the world, that, you know, I kind of got motivated by that. So he made an introduction for me this at HBR, you know, this is the old days, you know, kind of when you had editors there who would really work with you, and you had more lengthy pieces compared to, you know, it's different now, but back then, you know, you would work with an editor, and so that turned out to be a really interesting experience. The editor was very helpful because I didn't really know how to do that kind of writing, you know, and but I learned a lot and was able to kind of take the thinking from the natural resource-based view, which was an academic piece, and now put it into a different language, you know. And so that came out in 1997 as a piece called Beyond Greening: Strategies for a Sustainable World. And I also had written some other things, did a couple of pieces of empirical work in that period as well. So I, you know, begun to build up a reasonable portfolio of publications in this kind of new emerging space of environment and sustainable business. And lo and behold, you know, after 2 or 3, 4 years, other schools start getting interested in me and began approaching me. So I was approached by UNC, and they made me a tenured offer to come down there and start a center focused around this, and so I took it.
This is space. I'm going to riff off of something you just said. How do you learn to write for the audience of practitioners? We all sort of learn in our doctoral programs how to write for academics, but for many of us, learning to write for practitioners is a wholly different skill set and something that is very difficult to do. How do you begin to think about that?
Well, you just decide you're going to do it, right? And the best way to do it is to read a lot of that work, right? I mean, I think as professors, we do tend to at least assign readings for teaching, you know, from journals like Harvard Business Review and you know, Sloan and California Management Review and so forth. So we assign that, and we do read it, right? I mean, we read it, but I think the way you have to decide that you want to actually write, you know, write pieces for those journals, and so the best way to do that is to when you read that work, read it from the point of view of how would you take your work, right, and put it into that kind of format. And I think it's learn by doing, right? And then also, you know, if you're not already, you know, sort of friendly with someone who has been successful in writing in that space, you should befriend someone, and they can give you feedback, right, on what you're writing, because it is a bit of a different game than academic writing. And I personally think it's really important to be able to hit on both of those cylinders, that and to be able to kind of toggle, you know, back and forth between the two is a skill, but it's a developable skill, right? And I think it's an important one. So, and then, you know, then maybe there's a third leg of that stool, which is book writing, right? I mean, and there are more academically oriented books, and then there are more, practitioner oriented books, and so I think the same thing applies there, right? And that, so I, over time now, had an opportunity to be involved in both types of books, right? And that's also, I think, a kind of an interesting ambidextrous skill set that I think is important. If you're going to be in a business school, then you ought to have something directly to say to practice. And I think, little by little, business schools are coming around to that realization. I think it's understood increasingly that we went too far. The pendulum swung too far in the academic direction, and that little by little, we're beginning to see that. Well, maybe publishing a piece in HBR or Sloan or Stanford Social Innovation Review or that sort of thing shouldn't be a black mark against you. Maybe it's neutral, or maybe it even counts a little. Like back then, that was seen as almost like a career ender. Right? I mean, you were so discouraged from doing something like that you were wasting your time, because you could be spending the time on the next AMJ piece, right? And instead, you're wasting it writing this Harvard Business Review article. Why are you doing that? But I think at least now you don't have that sense so much anymore, right? That there might still be, a tendency to look down on those pieces, but now I think at least there's a sense that there's some value to it, right? And so that's changing, and that's good. But I think there's huge value to it, and especially being able to commingle the two types of writing.
Yeah, I just want to remind people that if you have questions for Stu, you can put them into the chat column or the Zoom chat box, and we'll get to them in a little bit. I just want to reflect on that. And one of the people I spoke to, who's now a very famous professor, told me that he once wrote something for the Wall Street Journal, and a couple of his colleagues came in and literally screamed at him for, how dare you be writing for this publication?
Yeah,
I thought was very ironic.
You're going off the reservation.
Yeah. So you were in North Carolina, and then you moved to Cornell, where you were founded the Center for Sustainable Global Enterprise, and more recently you've come to the University of Vermont. And I wonder if you could, in doing that, you tried to go emeritus at one point, and I know you got recruited to the University of Vermont. So all of the plans for retirement, such as they were, I guess, didn't come to fulfillment. So could you talk a little bit about what happened there?
Yeah. So, from UNC, which was a very good experience, right? And actually ended up, we established a center there, the Center for Sustainable Enterprise, brought a bunch of this into the curriculum there. And then I had several doctoral students, right, that, during my stint, I worked with some doctoral students when I was at Michigan too, but it tended to be not focused in this content area, right? It tended to be more generic strategy. But at UNC, all of the doctoral students I worked with, this was their focus, right? So it was sustainable business and base of the pyramid business. So I had doctoral students like Mark Milstein, Ted London, right, who's now at the Davidson Institute, Eric Simonis, and a few others were all doctoral students there at the time, and so that added another dimension to it, right? That it's possible for PhD students to kind of get involved in this space as well, and to have a career, that would be somewhat relevant to this. And then I think the Cornell thing was evidence that there was some draw, right? I mean, Sam Johnson gave a gift to start a center and endowed a chair, and I was recruited for that, right? So, and that was also a very good experience. We had built that up. That became even a larger kind of center than what we had done at UNC. And then, eventually Mark Milstein, who did his PhD at UNC, we recruited him there. He became the director of the center, and had an associate director, recruited another faculty member in the area, and we had continued to kind of build up. We had a little bit of a sequence, right, like a concentration, more than just like an elective course or two, and so that kind of ramped it up a bit further. But it became very evident after about 5 or 6 years that was as far as we were going to go. right, for a variety. And we had opportunities. There were donors that were potentially interested in taking it to another level, but it became very evident that that wasn't a priority, right? And so I'd reached a point in my life where, you know, I didn't see myself just kind of repping the same thing until I retired. So I decided that, you know, and we had been away, you know, moved away from Ann Arbor, or, you know, where we had lived for almost 20 years, and not that we disliked, you know, either Chapel Hill or Ithaca, but you know, we got to a point where, you know, it matters where you live, and so decided we wanted to move back there. So I decided to do phased retirement and go emeritus, and we moved back to Ann Arbor, and that was about the time that we started up in earnest this little nonprofit consulting firm called Enterprise for a Sustainable World, and that involved kind of working directly with companies, kind of, I suppose you would call it consulting, but it tended to be more programmatic, you know, sort of project consulting for companies that were interested in really sort of moving into this space in a more aggressive way. But then it also had to do with this base of the pyramid network that, you know, we had started this thing when I was at UNC called the BOP Learning Lab, you know, because it was just after, you know, I need to circle back now to the late days at Michigan, because just before I left, Prahalad and I got kind of tied up doing a piece together. It was the first and only piece that we actually wrote together. Because shortly after, you know, I had the Beyond Greening piece that was in Harvard Business Review. He and a guy named Ken Lieberthal, right, who's a China expert, were crafting a piece. This would have been his like fourth or fifth piece in HBR, but they were crafting a piece that was about, you know, emerging China and India. And it had, initially their title was something like Competing in Opaque Markets or something like that, you know, and then, you know, HBR got a hold of it and, you know, turned it into The End of Corporate Imperialism. You know, so they're really good at, you know, titling. And the same thing happened with the piece that CK and I wrote about, because what sparked it was, you know, he gave me feedback on the Beyond Greening paper, which, you know, the core message was just, you know, sort of incremental improvement, you know, emission reduction and waste reduction in the US, Europe, and Japan isn't going to get us there, right? That is, we really need to be thinking more about how does business engage in sustainable development in the developing and emerging world. That was really the core message. And then their piece, you know, was about emerging China and India and how you can't just copy paste from the triad. But we realized that no one had really sort of decided to write something specifically about how large established corporations, you know, there were SMEs and microfinance institutions and so forth even then, but no one had written a piece about how or why an existing large global corporation might want to actually focus on the underserved and the poor at the bottom of the income pyramid as a business opportunity. So we set about doing that, right, and kind of went through a few iterations of this thing. And originally the paper was entitled Raising the Bottom of the Pyramid, Strategies for Sustainable Development. That was our title. And nobody would publish it. Yeah. And so we went through maybe 5 or 6 iterations. It became kind of an underground paper. And it began to get, you know, some traction with companies. And then I left in the process. I went to UNC in '98, and we still hadn't, but we continued to work on it. And, you know, and CK's off doing his thing. And when I got to UNC, we had, you know, some doctoral students who were interested in this. So we launched this thing called the BOP, Base of the Pyramid BOP Learning Lab, because there were lonely people in companies, you know, and entrepreneurs and financiers and people from the multilaterals that were interested in this, but they didn't have anybody to talk to. So it became almost like a support group where they would come, and we'd hold these meetings a couple of times a year called the BOP Learning Lab. And it got so that people were traveling in from overseas, you know, to come to these meetings. And then they started their own. They began starting their own kind of learning labs and innovation centers in Europe and in Latin America and Asia and so forth. Such that by like 2009 or 10, when I started on the phased retirement thing, there were like 18 of these BOP labs around the world, and they each had their own, they were all different. Some were at universities, some were NGOs, some were companies, some were in part of the national chamber, and they were all, but they each had their own story, and they each, stood on their own 2 feet. But most of them didn't know about each other, and the only thing, we were the one thing in common. We were like the hub of these, these spokes. So we thought, well, maybe there's value in trying to actually connect them together. And we were doing a lot of work in Brazil at the time, and the company Natura in Brazil, we were doing a bunch with them, and they gave us a grant in 2009 to launch something we were calling the BOP Global Network, which involved connecting these various labs together, but then also looking to grow new ones, to kind of find new partners and move into geography where there were none. So that got started in like 2010, and now that's like 35 BOP labs and innovation centers, and Enterprise for a Sustainable World became the hub for that. So that I sort of saw myself, and part of that was also getting involved in starting this new institute in India called Emergent Institute, which was focused on developing a kind of an action learning curriculum for Indian entrepreneurs and corporate entrepreneurial teams, focused on building environmentally sustainable and socially inclusive businesses. So we had a couple of investors and supporters for that from India. It was shortly after CK passed away, right? And Ray Anderson died the same year, right? Ray Anderson, the founder and CEO of Interface. And so part of the vision was to take, sort of the environmental vision of Ray, and then CK later published the book, The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. And in India, that made a big impression, and bring those two streams together, right? So, and I was doing this work at the time on doing that, right? Which I call Green Leap, which is converging the green agenda with the inclusion agenda. Not that green is just for rich, kind of Western people, and that, business and poverty should forget about environment because it's for rich and Western people, but rather, how do we converge those two things together? That was really the message in the Beyond Greening article, like from 20 years ago. And so that's really what Emergent Institute was all about. And we brought in, a bunch of collaborators that were US based, but also India based collaborators, and developed a curriculum that iterated between classroom and field, with mentorship and field support for conceptualizing and launching new sustainable and inclusive businesses, either as entrepreneurial ventures or as corporate entrepreneurial ventures. So I was spending a lot of time in India, like in the 2011, 12, 13 timeframe. And one of those collaborators that, I got involved in this was a guy named Sanjay Sharma, who, probably many of you know. And Sanjay, had known him for a long time already. He made his name in the sustainable business field, then went on the dean track, and he became the dean of the business school at Concordia University, the John Molson School of Business, which is Canada's largest business school. He's very successful there, raised a ton of money, built a new building in downtown Montreal, hired a bunch of faculty in every functional area focused on sustainability, recruited Paul Shrivastava to come there, and so forth. And but then I think, he probably wouldn't say this, but I think he kind of burned out. It was like 400 faculty, a really complicated place. And then the dean job came open at the University of Vermont, which is just an hour and 20-minute drive down the road across the border. And so I'm hearing about this. We're sitting in India, and he's telling me about this. And my first reaction was, wow, I didn't even know Vermont had a business school. But the more we talked about it, it became clear that what was going through his mind was, this is an opportunity to kind of, think of it as a platform to be a disruptor, right? That, because you can't really reinvent at established incumbent schools, and I'd spent my whole career at, incumbent schools with established MBA programs, where the best you can do is innovate around the edge. You few elective courses, or maybe you get a sequence or a concentration in the second year or something like that. But the core pretty much remains unchanged. Maybe, you get a class here and there that's integrated into core courses, but the core basically stays the same. So, I think his vision was, that Vermont could be a place where you could reinvent, right? And so he took the job, and one of the first things he did was eliminate the existing MBA program, which was, small and shrinking and losing money and not very well known. And so he didn't get a lot of pushback. The central administration people didn't fight him because they wanted it mainly for the money. And since it was small, there weren't a lot of faculty members whose load was dependent on it. So nobody fought it that much, which could never happen at Cornell or Michigan or North Carolina, right? I mean, it just would never happen. So he abolished it and then challenged the faculty to come back with an idea for a new MBA program that they could make stick, they could build reputation around, that was consistent with Vermont, right? And perhaps unsurprisingly, they came back with, well, there ought to be an MBA program focused on sustainability and entrepreneurship and innovation, and unanimously approved, creating a new program that is now called the Sustainable Innovation MBA. But then came the time to actually figure out what that meant. and so about that point, he said, would you be interested maybe coming? I could bring you on as like an adjunct consultant. And I said, sure, sounds interesting. So I started going and met the faculty, and then there were some really good people there, right? And they weren't resistant. They were excited. They could see where this could really put the school on the map. And one thing led to another, and Sanjay being Sanjay, he raised money, got the school named, got the single biggest gift in the history of the university, so it's now the Grossman School of Business. And one thing led to another, and lo and behold, and then Grossman endowed these chairs, so I hold a Grossman chair, one of 3 Grossman chairs. And, we were in this really cool position of being able to start with a clean sheet of paper and develop a completely new curriculum from scratch that was focused entirely on creating the sustainable, inclusive businesses of tomorrow. And that's what's now become the Sustainable Innovation MBA. So I spent the last, now 6 years really working with the faculty there and colleagues to first develop that curriculum and stand it up, but then, became co-director of the program. And that became an enormously big learning experience because, it's not a big school, so you don't have like a big admissions group and a big, career office and placement group. So it was incumbent upon us, our little group of faculty colleagues, and maybe 1 or 2 in particular, to figure out how you're going to actually promote this program. How do you market it? Where do you find the prospective students for a program like this? Because without students, you don't have a program. And then on the back end, it would be completely disingenuous if we just did a bolt-on conventional MBA placement office, with the usual MBA recruiter jobs, because that's not what the program's about. The program is about being a entrepreneur, change maker, disruptor, and so forth. And there aren't a lot of conventional MBA placement jobs that have those words in the job title. So we realized after 2 or 3 years, of launching the program, you can't just have graduates fall off the cliff. Well, we knew that from the start, but after, once you get the program going, you can now really begin to pay attention to, we built up an advisory board, had some corporate support and company support and B Corp support and entrepreneur support and so forth, because those are really our constituencies, right? It's corporate transformation, purpose-driven companies, sustainable inclusive venturing, sustainable finance and impact investing, transformational consulting, and NGOs that focus on this. Those are our 6 constituency groups. That, we needed to develop a completely new customized back end that we call launch, not placement, that is consistent with the purpose of the program, because we're a purpose-driven MBA program. And so that's now, we've been able to kind of get all of that in place. And for this year is the first year that program now has its head above water. We're critical mass, above break even. It's built up some reputation, at least in the, the rankings that we pay attention to, which would be the Princeton Review, Green MBA, and the Corporate Knights Better World MBA. We've been number 1 in the Princeton Review Green MBA for the last 2 years, and we're ranked number 1 in the U.S. in the Corporate Knights ranking and number 5 in the world this past year. I think we've actually been successful in at least getting the thing to stand up on 2 feet. And so at this point in my life, I'm beginning to, this will be the last year that I'm a chaired professor there. I'll continue to stay involved. But, now really sort of feel like I've got something to say again. So I haven't written that much in the last 2, 3, 4 years because we've been so focused on this. Written some, like Sanjay and I wrote a piece called Beyond Saddlebag Sustainability in Business Education. That's really about what we're doing at Vermont, and we use the metaphor saddlebag, because I think that's really what my life was prior to this, that we were really good at designing high quality saddlebags that hang off the side of the MBA horse, but that you don't change the horse. And so what we're doing at Vermont is reinventing the horse.
Interesting. So I'm hearing to do the kinds of things that I would say intellectual shamans do. You have to be entrepreneurial. You have to be willing to take some risks. You have to be passionate about what you're doing and to be a disruptor. And those are certainly characteristics that you exhibit. I'm going to turn to some of the questions that we've got in the chat room here. So from Katharina Sproul, she wants to know if you felt part of in the early days, did you feel part of the environmental movement? And then have you published anything about your experiences as a serial center founder? And then I'll just add a third question here. Marina wants to know, how is it to make a revolutionary vision to engage people in the private world while maintaining the tension of the scientific orientation as well?
Yeah. I very much felt myself, like really sort of swept up in the environmental movement in the 70s. That was really what kind of fired my passion, right? And I don't feel as though I've lost that, right? I look at, I look at the leverage points differently, right? That over time I've become increasingly convinced that kind of creative work in the private sector is a real leverage point. So it's just really a question of what levers do you think where can you devote your time and energy and be most effective at creating change? And, I've sort of settled on this one that doesn't diminish the importance of other levers, whether it's civil society or government policy or what have you. It's just that this is the one I've settled on, right? And I feel pretty good about it. There's still a long way to go, but I feel pretty good about it. I feel like we've made headway.
Yeah.
That.
And the tension between sort of this engagement with practice and maintaining a scientific credibility, academic credibility, I guess.
Again, I'm a professional school faculty member. I'm a business school faculty member, and I've always felt, like going back to that. I think I probably learned this from Prahalad, that if you're in a professional school, you ought to have something to say to practice. If you don't want to be in a professional school, then you should be in one of the core disciplines. Should be in the economics department, or the psych department, but I'm a business school professor, so I don't see any conflict at all. I actually see, the toggling between the world of practice and scholarship as essential to doing work that has any relevance and meaning.
Yeah, it's that boundary spanning role that I talk about as connection, and you certainly exemplify that. The next question is from Remy from Peru. It's a very long question, but I'm going to synthesize it. And he's a more junior faculty member, and he's wondering how to get his dean to take seriously this issue of sustainability. And I had actually written down that as a question that I wanted to ask you. How do you get sustainability to be a priority, both for business and for business schools? So that we're not doing saddlebag type stuff anymore, basically.
Yeah, I guess one of the things I've learned is that it doesn't pay to try to push a rope uphill.
Mm-hmm.
That
pushing spaghetti is what my
analogy. Yeah. So you're probably not going to change your dean. That you just if you make that your mission, then you'll become a very frustrated person. The best thing you can do is figure out how to do work and have impact in the immediate, where you have some locus of control, and where you can have real influence, which would be maybe some colleagues in your school or in your department or in other schools in the university, so that you're able to kind of build up a little bit of an intellectual community that's right there, that is accessible to you. But then probably the more important thing is to have, an intellectual community network at other universities that, that share your interest and passion, that can help you, in sort of your quest to do important work. Because at the end of the day, what really makes it is that you produce something, that you produce research and writing that has impact and matters. Because even though we talked earlier about how, discouraged HBR publishing was, the truth is if you publish a piece and it has a big impact, then even those core academics, and especially the deans, they kind of like that, right? Because suddenly you become a known quantity and you help build the reputation of the school, right? And especially with companies, right, which deans do have companies as constituency groups. So having some faculty members that have actually had impact on business helps the dean, right? Even if the dean sometimes has to tread a careful path in talking about the role of research and scholarship and promotion and tenure and so forth. So don't underestimate the importance of actually having impact out there in the world to being attractive as a faculty member at other schools, if not the one that you're currently at. So I think the most important advice is build up a good professional network of colleagues, who share this passion, who can or you can work with, maybe you collaborate with them in writing, and what you're teaching, right? To kind of bring it into your teaching, those things you control, right? And if you're not able, if there isn't kind of a groundswell of student interest, because don't underestimate student interest at the school. The students probably have more sway with the dean than you do as a faculty member. So if there's a student movement for this, that can really matter. That's what happened, at Michigan. There was a real student movement for this. It was one of the two places where Students for Responsible Business got started, and that became that impact. So, having strong student interest really makes a difference. That's a leverage point.
And then Michael has a question. Do you have any best practices or lessons for center founders that you'd like to share?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I think that centers there can be a lot of different types of centers, so I would say and I've been involved in maybe the two main types would be centers that you build from the ground up, like where there's nothing and there's no support. And most of the time those, we started at Michigan, there was the dual degree program. That's really what got things started. And then there was a donor that came that was interested in giving money to create a center, and that was the Herb, right? That became the Herb Institute. And it was originally called the Herb Institute for Environmental Management, and it was separate from the dual degree program, but the existence of the dual degree program is what attracted, the donor was persuaded by that, right? So if you don't have donors, like at Cornell, I was recruited because Sam Johnson had already given a gift, right? So we actually had some endowment resources to work with. That puts you in a very different position from the standpoint of developing a center from trying to bootstrap one from the ground up, right? So I think that would be the first distinction to make, that it matters whether you're in bootstrap mode or whether there's already resources and you're able then to articulate kind of a strategy and a game plan for what you want to do. Probably the more typical position that you'd find yourself in would be bootstrapping. So, we're actually in bootstrap mode at Vermont right now, right? We now have this MBA program. We want to create a center, but you need, part of it is having an intellectual vision, but then also having something compelling to sell and having a donor at some point support it. Now, I think more and more there are probably funders. There is faculty research-based work that could receive larger scale funding, but I think this also goes against the grain of business school research culture, which tends to be kind of individual, faculty artisan research. I think that one of the game changers could be if business schools could become to look a little bit more like other units around campus, where you have, a real research focus, where there are multiple faculty kind of working around a common theme. then you go out and get larger scale funding from, National Science Foundation or from foundations or what have you. But that tends to be much less common.
So if I could just synthesize a little bit what I heard from the last couple of questions, you need to, as a faculty member, you need to do good work that gets your name recognized and makes you sort of an authority on something, and build an agenda in doing that, and then take it someplace where it's valued. And that, I mean, leaving where you are.
It may involve that.
Yeah.
So it may involve, needing to be flexible as to location.
Yeah. There's two questions here, though, both about the current situation with respect to climate change. So the IPCC report that came out a few weeks back, very scary, and another question about what's your assessment of the current climate crisis, and what do we need to be doing about that, basically. A little minor question there.
Yeah, it is scary. It is scary, but I'd say it's predictably scary, right? At some level. So again, if our focus is how can the business world have impact here, then I think that nothing changes there, right? I mean, I think that the negotiations around Paris or the role that a given country like the U.S. might play, those are really important discussions to have. But I mean, I find that the companies I'm working with and the ones that I want to work with are unaffected by that, right? Whether the current, occupant of the presidency in the U.S. is on board or not doesn't really affect their decisions, especially global companies, about how they're going to approach, the threat or the challenge or the opportunity of climate change. So in some ways, being focused on business as a leverage point has advantages that way. And, I guess one of the things I'm finding is that the SDGs, as complicated and numerous as they are, I think really have served to rally some corporate attention out there in the world, that they become kind of a rallying cry. And that for those companies that actually are taking it seriously, and there's growing numbers of them, they're doing more than just sort of checking the box that, okay, we're having, in our corporate social responsibility report, we're having impact on SDG 3, 5, and 7. I think that's kind of the typical way to do it. But more and more companies are really kind of opening the hood, kind of looking under the hood of the SDGs. And because if you look beyond the 17 labels of the goals, there's 150 some goals and targets that, well, I mean, there's 170 total, but maybe 20 of them really are directly targeted at government. So there's 150 some that would be directly relevant to companies. And, and if you're persistent, you look at and you really try to internalize those as a company, it's hard to ignore, right? So I think more and more companies are doing more than just, kind of paying lip service to, eco-efficiency oriented stuff about their own operations and reducing energy use. And that you see more and more the climate issue entering their thinking around strategy for the entire value chain. We're going to look upstream in terms of sustainable sourcing, right? And that includes energy use and fossil use and so forth. And we're going to look downstream in terms of impact of our product system. And that includes, kind of the energy use issue. And then increasingly, I think you see kind of leading edge companies beginning to focus on this thing that Dow calls, Dow, I think Dow has a very interesting kind of easy to remember tool, for almost like a mnemonic for thinking about this, that when it comes to sustainability, you can think about the corporate footprint, which is the operational impact. And companies for a long time have been thinking about, kind of energy use there. But you can also think about the corporate handprint, which is upstream and downstream as well. Mm-hmm. But then, maybe emerging are, that there are more and more companies thinking about corporate blueprint. And corporate blueprint would be companies beginning to take collective action, where the aim is to build partnerships and platforms to get after real challenges out there in the world that extend beyond the product system of the company itself. So it's building platforms with maybe other companies, with NGOs, with government where appropriate, to pull the world in this direction.
Thank you. I think that's a great note to end on, Stu. I want to thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. I'm hearing our chimes ringing outside my office again, so it's 1 o'clock, and I want to thank everybody who logged in for participating, and Michael and Erica for setting all of this up. Thank you.
My pleasure. And happy holidays to everyone.
Yes, happy holidays.
Thank you, Stuart, for doing this. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Wonderful.
Thank you very much. Happy holidays.